Hello, everyone, and welcome to Balquell's Books. Today we are going to be discussing On Magic by Giordano Bruno, a book about which I have never in my life heard anybody talk about at all, which makes it, of course, a perfect candidate for an episode of Balquell's Books. You may have heard of this book, you may even have read this book, but you have never watched a YouTube video in which I talk about this book, unless, of course, you're watching this video for the second time. That is the tagline of Balquell's Books. So Giordano Bruno was a 16th century philosopher / strange individual. He was raised as a Dominican friar in a monastery, I suppose. He eventually fled from that life because he got into some ideas that they did not appreciate very much. He was reading books that they did not like and generally corrupting everyone and making a nuisance of himself. So he fled and he traveled around Europe. He worked for a French ambassador. He went to England. He was all over the place and generally making a nuisance of himself, publishing strange books and espousing his ideas about the universe, until finally he was burned at the stake by the Catholic Church because he was saying things that they thought either weren't true, weren't good, or weren't useful for the public to know about. So this book in particular that I'm discussing today, On Magic, I have it in an edition, a scholarly edition. It comes with the dialogue Cause, Principle, and Unity, which is a sort of Platonic dialogue about unity, the hierarchy and nature of being, and the nature of matter. And Cause, Principle, and Unity follows directly from another dialogue he wrote called The Ash Wednesday Supper, both of which are very funny and amusing and interesting, get into a lot of great ideas, and I think the dialogue form is perfectly suitable for specifically what Giordano Bruno likes to talk about. You get to see his ideas sort of thrown about in various different ways, various arguments. You get to see how they interact with the other ideas at the time. We're not talking about those today, but they're useful prior readings if you want to get into what I'm going to introduce today. So when we begin reading On Magic, we are confronted with a style that we may or may not be familiar with, that of Aristotle. Now, I haven't read very much Aristotle because I find it not particularly amusing to do so. Obviously, Giordano Bruno was raised on Aristotle. He was educated using Aristotle, which was very common for the time because Aristotle wrote about everything, and he wrote about it. He wrote a lot about everything, and his style is very clear, very analytical, and it gets at all the pieces, even though it is not particularly exciting. In Bruno's dialogues, he often talks mess about Aristotle. He brings up Aristotle a lot and saying, well, Aristotle didn't know this, or Aristotle was wrong about this or that. But you can see in this essay that he definitely has a lot of Aristotle still in him, because he begins by saying, before we say anything about magic, let us list some definitions of magic. And he lists 10 different definitions of magicians and of magic. I'll go through them quickly because you can sort of get the idea of what Bruno means when he talks about magic and what people at the time thought when they talked about magic. So the first definition is the magician as a wise man or a sage or a sort of magi. The second is the magician as, I guess, a chemist or medicine man, basically what we would consider nowadays to be a natural scientist. The third is a definition of magic as miracles. Fourth, we have magic as sort of natural reactions. So an example would be magnets, things that interact in ways that we don't really see. Fifth would be magic by the means of images, figures, symbols, so maybe runes or whatever. This is sort of the Kabbalistic form of magic, sort of putting words together or putting numbers together to do magic. Sixth would be prayers, rituals, ceremonies, rites that appeal to gods, demons, or heroes. So that's sort of, I guess, the Roman idea of magic. Seventh would be necromancy, which is self-explanatory. Eighth is using people's clothing or footsteps or various things that come from them in order to influence them. So we might think of something like voodoo as an example. Ninth, we have divination or prophecy. And 10th, we have magic as a pejorative, meaning a bad man who does evil things by hanging out with demons. And, that's no good. You don't really want to be involved with demons. So those are the 10 definitions he provides us. And which one does Bruno think is most suitable for what he's doing? I think we would say number 1 or 2. So the magician is a wise man, or what we would call nowadays a natural scientist. So how do we do magic? Or how is magic sort of conceived of? So Bruno, he loves hierarchies, he loves ladders and sort of placing things. He talks a lot about starting at the bottom, moving up, and then down a ladder to to have various levels and various powers. So I'm going to go through this scale quickly. I'm going to go forwards and backwards, or backwards and forwards, just to get an idea of what he thinks these different levels are. So we start with a universal soul, which is essentially God, and this soul is the unity of the universe. Everything is sort of imbued with this universal soul, and this is what provides harmony through everything. So there's that universal soul. Below it is the incorporeal gods. Then we have the celestial bodies, which are divine beings. We have what he calls spirits who reside in and control stars, and these spirits includes the earth. So make of that what you will, basically earth-like things. Below that we have the elements. Then we have the compounds. These compounds interact with our senses, which then go to our soul, and then the soul is imbued in the animal, which is the lowest form, basically the physical form. So if we go backwards, we have the animal, to the soul, to the senses, compounds, elements, spirits, which is, I guess, a planet that contains life like Earth, celestial bodies, which are divine beings, incorporeal gods, so gods that don't have any physical form, and then we have the most simple, best, greatest, incorporeal, absolute, and self-sufficient being, as Bruno calls it, which is God. So we have to remember, when we think about this, that Bruno is existing in a pre-scientific age. Not that they didn't know anything, but that they didn't have what we today. They didn't conceive of science in the same way as we do today. So they didn't have things like Newtonian physics, because Newton wasn't around yet. They didn't have a conception of chemistry or chemical bonds. They had alchemy, which is using the same principles as chemistry and basically doing a lot of the same things, but with very different terminology and very different goals of what they believed could be achieved via chemistry and alchemy. So magic, in Bruno's view, is an explanation of how things act. I mentioned before we have magnets. Magnets do things that we can't really explain because we can't see what is causing the things to be attracted or unattracted or pushed away from the magnets. So nowadays we would have terminology. We have terminology in physics such as the forces: strong force, weak force, gravity, what are the other ones? Thermomagnetism or something like that. The question, Why do we have those four forces? For example, why is there gravity and why are there weak force and strong force? Remains just as unsolved now as ever, even with all our calculations and such forth. Why these forces and not any other forces is a question we can't answer. And it's a question that someone like Bruno was a bit more interested in than modern physicists would be. So when we think about how things interact and what makes sort of physical interactions possible, what makes the harmony of all the universe possible, we have to think about souls. Everything has a soul in Bruno's conception. All sort of entities in the universe have a soul, and physical matter does not interact. All interactions are performed via souls, or you might call them, I guess, Platonic forms or something like this. So the way this is done is that all things in the universe are united by this universal soul, a universal spirit, or God that we mentioned earlier. That is what provides harmony and determines the sort of actions and reactions of different things. So each soul, you might be reminded of someone like Leibniz with his monads, that each sort of entity has a soul and that they all are sort of a microcosm of the biggest, or of the entire universe, and such. They don't really need to interact with each other because they all contain everything else within them. This is somewhat similar to that. I can't say I understand Leibniz completely, so I might be off base on that partially. But anyway, so each object, each soul, contains the universal soul within it. It is not a part of the universal soul. It is the entire universal soul is in it. So microcosm is probably the best word to use. So it's in the same way that, so the soul is in the human body. So for example, your soul is not in your hand, it's not in your head, it's not in your arm fully. Like, you can't locate your soul and just, take it out or anything like this. But if you cut off your finger, you're not cutting off a part of your soul. So your soul is indivisible, right? It's everywhere as a whole, all at once. And in the same way, the universal soul is in all the different parts of the universe, not as a part, but as a whole. We can compare the universal soul maybe to something like Tao, as a sort of a universal force that works in all things, if that helps you conceive of it. So now that we have this conception of the unity of the universe, we might want to take a look at magic and how it works. So Bruno conceives of magic via bonds, via attraction. So things want to do certain things, or they have desires of what they want to do, if you want to anthropomorphize it in that way. So his ideas of attractions and bonds, this terminology gives us a very holistic view because it applies to all things, all forces, and this includes sort of human communication, this includes physical interaction, this includes pushing something, also includes things like magic and such forth. We have attractions. There are two kinds of attractions that things can have. So there's attractions through agreement. So two things want to come together, or they want to interact, and so they do so. And then without agreement, a more powerful force will act on another entity. So with agreement, we might think of something like love. Without agreement, we might think of something like coercion, if we're thinking in human terms. As well as these attractions and such forth, we have demons. And demons are very important because demons cause a lot of trouble. In Bruno's conception, demons are corporeal. However, they are very thin, and so we cannot see them. But they do have a corporeal body, and we know this because they have animal emotions. They have animal desires. They have hunger and lust, or all these sorts of things. Demons can get into your head via their thinness. They can cause... He says they potentially might cause illnesses, mental illnesses, physical illnesses, and really just cause a lot of problems. So once again, we have to remember here that Bruno is working in the Renaissance, and we have We don't have microscopes, we don't have telescopes, we don't have anything like this. There are certain things that when you're looking at the world from a human point of view without the use of tools or technology, or at least the tools and technology we have today, that you just can't really explain. Things like physical and mental illnesses are very difficult to look at, with a human eye and understand. And so we need something like demons as an explanation. If we want to have knowledge of these things and why they might happen, we have to come up with some sort of framework by which to understand them. And this is how demons can be used. It's not quite as silly as it might seem when you first look at it. What's interesting here about these bonds, or these attractions, as I mentioned earlier, is that they apply both to physical things and to human communication. And this is where Bruno goes in his general account of bonding, which follows directly after his essay on magic. And on bonding is much more concerned with the human aspect, although it sort of talks about everything all at once. It just goes back and forth. Because he looks at it holistically, he doesn't say, well, this is the human part and this is the physical part. Everything is everything. But for the most part, bonds are concerned, or in the general account of bonding, he's concerned with human influences. So this is sort of his explanation of things like psychology, when we would think of psychology today. So the question of how rhetoric influences people, how art and music can influence people, and how people can be influenced through their imagination. So things don't actually need to exist, or they don't actually need to happen, but if we are imagining them, then they're influencing us, and thus we are bonding, or we are being bonded. All bonds, in his account, are based on love. So you might, for example, you might go hear a speaker speak and think his ideas are great, or think what he says is really interesting, and you want to follow what he says and you want to hear more. You have been bonded to him in Bruno's view. He now has you sort of under his sway via his rhetoric. And the same is true if you really enjoy a book or a song. You're being bonded to it. And it is influencing you in that way. And those would be obviously bonds that are... Oh, I guess you don't know. They could be with agreement or they could be without agreement. I mean, a rhetorician can convince you even if you don't want to be convinced. Usually with art, you're bringing the desire to be convinced with you. In the end, so with these bonds, we have a science based on a universal harmony, all of which is actuated by love, which I think is kind of nice. You can see why Bruno had a little bit of a resurgence in the 60s. It's just kind of an interesting way to think about psychology, or the ways in which humans interact at these sort of bonds. We shouldn't think of bonds exclusively as something negative where you're tying someone up, but bonds can obviously be nice, like the bond of marriage when two people love each other a lot and then they get married. That's a good bond. We like that sort of bond. To get a bit more a broad view on Bruno. So I just introduced some of Bruno's ideas, and I think there's a lot of value in looking at people like Bruno from a different era, who have a different way of conceiving of things. It seems to me that Bruno knew quite a lot intuitively, that he understood quite a lot of things that people would understand in more concrete terms later, but Bruno didn't quite have the technology or terminology that we have in the modern era to describe these things. So I wouldn't say he's lacking in terminology, it's just his terminology is quite different, and so this is why I think he's not generally read as much nowadays. He's kind of difficult to understand because he talks about things in an entirely different way. When I first got into reading Renaissance sort of philosophy and Renaissance ideas, it really seemed to me like people were just being very wacky, making up crazy explanations, talking about demons and magic, and they were just kind of making it up as they went along, or making up stories. But I think now, as I've gotten more into it, I realize that they're really talking about many of the same things we talk about today. They understood a lot of the things we understood today. They just talked about it with different words. They thought about it in different terms, and they had different priorities and different things they want to do with this knowledge. Like I mentioned earlier with Bruno, he intuitively knew a lot of things. One of these things, or one of these aspects that he intuited, was outer space. In the Ash Wednesday supper, he gets a lot into outer space. He conceived of space as infinite, which was rare at the time. He was following Copernicus, who realized that the Earth revolves around the sun and not vice versa. Bruno looked out at the stars and said, well, all those must be suns, and they must all have their own planets, many of which are probably like Earth, spirits like Earth, and we are one of many of them. So because of these sorts of things and the fact that he was burned at the stake, many people would consider, or do consider, Bruno as a martyr for modern science, as a sort of scientist out of time, perhaps. But I don't think this is quite a correct characterization. He was very much within the spirit of the Renaissance. He was maybe just pushing the envelope a bit more than other Renaissance thinkers were. But if you read his works, he's definitely very embedded in that time and characteristic of that time. He was just a genius, which makes him a cool guy. Bruno's conception of knowledge, Bruno, he aims at universality and not particularity, and this is something that differentiates him from perhaps modern conceptions of science, where there's a lot of specializations. So you can learn about chemistry, you can learn about biology, you can learn about physics, you could even learn about molecular biology or genetic biology or biochemistry or all these different things. The idea of a holistic view is not quite as important. So we have people within those fields who maybe won't be as knowledgeable about the other fields, and then sort of the disciplines in themselves, the publications or whatever, are contained. They don't reach for everything all at once. Bruno believed that he could know everything. He could come up with a conception of the world that was universal, that could allow him to explain everything that happens in it via these bonds, these attractions, this sort of magic and the universal soul. And I think that's the reason he conceives of it this way is because, like I said, with the universal soul, if everything is in harmony, clearly we must be part of that. We are also part of the harmony. We are a microcosm of the universal soul by virtue of having it imbued within us, and that we can, through meditation and through learning, sort of ascend this ladder, and understand higher and higher things, so interact with these sort of spirits and celestial bodies above us, and that will grant us further and further knowledge. It might remind you of something like Hegel, I suppose, this sort of ascension into further knowledge. Same sort of spirit here. And I think that's a very, inspirational and interesting way of looking at the world, this belief that you can understand the world. And I think with the specialization of science in the modern day, I think we've lost some of that. I think a lot of people almost give up. They sort of, I can't think of this word, they allow the scientists or the experts to sort of think for them, and they say, well, they know this, so I'll just believe what they say, because I can't possibly understand everything, and so this person understands that, this person understands this, and I'll listen to them, and such forth. I think there is, people have a greater power than they might conceive in terms of understanding the universe as an individual. And that is something that philosophy and reading people like Bruno can help you come to understand and come to sort of manifest in your own life. So that's why I think reading Bruno can be, and other Renaissance philosophers as well, can be very handy. It can be very valuable and interesting to have this new idea of what humans are capable of, and a different view of the way the universe works. Man, this conclusion sucked. Whatever. Well, that's the end of the video. Okay, that's not the end of the video, but well, it is the end of the video, but that's a terrible way to end a video. Thank you everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. I enjoyed it. I like this guy. He's one of my heroes, and I will probably talk about him again. And I will be back. Previously, I would not be back. I often just left and never came back. Now I'm back, and I will be back again. So be prepared, and have fun reading books. The end. Goodbye.